A very good afternoon to all of you. Today, we have a very, very special guest, and a guest is here, and I am here with him to celebrate his birthday and making Eclectica a platform for that. Welcome, Rudy, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Well, to all of you, to my dear audience, let me just introduce my guest. Rudi Schmidt, he is the CEO of mmunetrue, a real world data company focusing on immunological data using artificial intelligence for research and development. He was also the former EVP at Asklepios Hospitals, Europe's second largest hospital chain, and managing director of a R&D company affiliated with Asklepios. So today we are going to talk a very very interesting subject, and Rudy is an expert in this. Well, what we will be actually discussing is basically about precision medicine, the challenges that we have in real world about the clinical trials, and what exactly the future holds for us with precision medicine. Well then, Rudy, it is time that I start shooting my questions to you.
Go ahead. I'm waiting what you have prepared.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Rudy, my first question would be like, what is the difference between clinical reality and clinical trials in that way?
Oh, there are many differences, but I guess I should focus on the most important. The most important from my point of view is that the patients in clinical reality are far more older and have more comorbidities compared to the participants of clinical trials. So I would say sometimes I wonder how in trials they manage to include so young patients, and in reality they're 10, 15, in average sometimes 20 years older. And of course 2 decades make a difference if you have average patients with 55, 60, 65, and in clinical reality you see patients far more older than 80 years. Then of course that has consequences when it comes to inflammation, for example, the immune response, and of course the comorbidities. In clinical trials, people are, I sometimes little bit, well, funny bone like said, they are almost completely healthy except that one diagnosis. And in clinical reality, you rarely see a patient who has less than 2 or 3 comorbidities. And that, of course, changes a lot of in reality when you try to treat that patients.
Right, correct. So, now all these, whatever we do, whether we see patients and we do clinical trials, is it's all about it's generating a lot of data. So, my next question would be like, how? I mean, does this real world data give us more realistic picture of the exact reality? I mean, how exactly is this?
Um, it has its own challenges, real world data. So first of all, when we talk about real world data, we also have to talk about the data source.
Correct.
And most of the time, we're talking about the patient file. And of course, the patient file is not the 100% digital twin of the patient that you see in your outpatient practice or in the acute hospital. But of course, it has by far more data points, and it is by far more representative compared to clinical trials. And realistic, I mentioned already that the patients
Yeah.
are older and have comorbidities, but that has consequences when it comes to a realistic picture, because most of that comorbidities need to be treated, whether it's in an acute hospital or in an outpatient thing. And now you want to treat maybe, for example, cancer, and at the same time the patient has an autoimmune disease or the patient has a cardiovascular comorbidity, then you're challenged as treating physicians. So take example number one, the patient with autoimmune disease who was treated with immune modulation to suppress the immune system, and now he got cancer. And when you treat a cancer, you want to stimulate or you want to improve the crosstalk between the tumor and the immune system, because the tumor managed to escape the immune reaction, and now you want to trigger an immune reaction. And on the other side, you have to treat that autoimmune disease. So maybe if it's colitis ulcerosa and you stop the immune suppression,
Mm.
then there will be severe effects for the patient. And now what to do? Similar thing is with cardiovascular diseases, things like drug interaction or immune related adverse events when you treat the cancer, and then you have issues with cardiovascular adverse events. Then you have to make a decision: shall I stop the cancer treatment, or shall I stop the treatment of the comorbidity, or which one shall I switch? And then we are already immediately into something like clinical reality. And when you go back to that clinical trials, there's no guidance out of that. And
Mm.
sometimes even in the guidelines from medical societies, you can't find a description for all that scenarios. So yes, real world data is by far more realistic, I would say, and by far it's a vast amount of data compared to clinical trials where you sometimes have some hundred participants, and in reality you have 10,000, hundred thousands, or even millions of patients over the years in whatever kind of data stock, if you go to run something like a data stock. So there are other challenges that has to do with documentation of that reality. And yeah, it is difficult to find something like a ground truth.
Yeah, I think I was just trying to understand that whether can there be even such a thing as ground truth in medicine. I think that is what that you already answered, I guess. So
No, I wouldn't say that I've answered that. Well, I have some idea on that issue of
great.
ground truth, if you want.
Sure, sure.
So, well, I found out that you're pretty interested in genetics.
Yes, very much.
I, I stick with the example of the oncological patient, and then we test the tumor, and maybe we go for genetic testing,
Mm.
or we do some other kind of genetic testing for whatever kind of disease. And then the first issue is, can we really say that the genetic data is a ground truth, or is it an interpretation? And if you go deep down into the machine room of genetic testing, it all starts with DNA extraction, and then the sequencing depth, and maybe even the device that you use, maybe from a well-known famous American supplier with
Right.
with family-friendly prices for the consumables. so, so what I want to say, the outcome, and then once you have some data from that sequencer, you still need bioinformatic to make an
Yes.
interpretation and stuck the whole thing together. And most people in clinical routine especially are not aware that that can make quite a big difference. And even most people go in clinical routine go for panel tests from
Mm.
a tumor. No one has an idea about the germline, and it's a panel test. It's not a whole genome. So then we can even start to discuss whether the result of a genetic test is something like a ground truth. Next thing is, when it comes to lab values, it's it's most often not standardized. And I have seen big pharmaceutical companies running really a lot of clinical trials. And when I ask them, would you be able to stack together the lab values from your trial patients? Yeah, silence was the answer, because when we dig down into the data, I don't want to say data jar, but data complexity, it turns out that some mission critical lab values hasn't have not been standardized and harmonized. So take, for
Mm.
example, albumin. You can express that in various ways in the lab report, and each physician has a look on that lab, sees albumin, and understands immediately what is the message, and has his own interpretation. But of course, if you want to stack together the data stocks to gain a large ground truth, you might have some challenges. And that is the issue, that the patient file is mixed out of something, so hardcore variables like we think they are hardcore variables like gene testing, lab values. And then there is the interpretation of
Right.
that values. And now, what is the ground truth? Maybe 1 year ago, the patient was diagnosed with something else, and 1 year later, we find out, oh, it was cancer. So now, what is the ground truth, and at which time? So that is pretty philosophical, I have to
Hmm.
admit. I guess we could talk hours about ground truth in medicine, but I would say no, there can't be a ground truth. In a limited scope, sometimes yes, but if you want to say it really overall, ground truth in medicine is pretty challenging, and today I would say out of reach.
That's very insightful information that you gave to all of us. And since we are talking about precision medicine and clinical trials, as we all know, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to clinical trials, actually doing it, understanding it, and uh, making a conclusion out of it, because it is also a very important area. So, can you I will ask you two questions together, maybe. Like, what are the challenges as such it exist at present day we have, specifically when it comes to clinical trials, and are there answers to this challenge? Are there real solutions present to these challenges?
Oh boy. Okay. Yes. Um, I think to give an overall idea, I would say that nowadays clinical trials have been outnumbered by biology and by the sponsors itself. The more data we go for, the more testing we do, the more subgroups we find. And the subgroups are smaller. And we also need specific participants to fill the comparison group, the control group. And that whole thing is, I don't want to say is out of control, but it got quite difficult, because then maths plays out its power. So statistical learning theory, where you say, okay, um, we have genetic features, genetic makeup. We find subgroups, and suddenly, initially, we had some kind of disease, maybe head and neck cancer or something like that, and now we find out, okay, there are 10 subgroups, and initially we had 200 participants in a clinical trial, and now each subgroup is represented by 20 participants, which means we have no chance to get statistical power. Now we have to
Right.
raise up patient numbers, while it is even more difficult to get additional participants. Nowadays, many large companies run clinical trials with 100 or more clinical trial sites to fill that trial, and it's quite challenging. Then the whole thing loses to be representative. You have ethnics, races, you have the genders, males, females, you have issues with the age I reported before. So the clinical trial loses his statistical power in the analysis. And that is really a challenge. And due to the fact that you are able to discover more subgroups, which raise the complexity, and then you have the curse of dimensionality with additional data classes, and all that together makes it even more expensive, and even almost sometimes almost impossible to run a proper clinical trial. And of course, regulatory requirements aren't anything but easy. And now main answers are, people try to go for decentralized clinical trials where the patients don't have to visit the clinical trial site, whether it's an outpatient ambulatory or in the acute hospital. They try to run decentralized clinical trials, which is like trying to treat a patient that is absent. That is possible, but if you want to have lab values, if you want to take a blood sample, then maybe you need physicians in the community. Then you have additional physicians. Then the question comes up: is the physician part of the treating team in the trial center at the acute hospital, or what is the role? So, and that goes and goes and goes and goes. So decentralized trials might be an answer. Next thing is that you try to fill up your control groups, for example, with already existing real world data. Because if you say, okay, a control group consists out of patients that are not treated with the new drug, but last year we treated patients like the standard. So why don't we take that cases as control group? That might also be an answer. And anything in between: decentralized clinical trials, more trial centers, more data classes, and real world data. That these are currently the answers to that challenges.
Great. So, in spite of these challenges that we have, and like you said about the solution also, what, according to you, is the future of clinical trials? How do you, as an expert, see this area of science?
Yeah, well, I would say the regulators woke up, or the lions woke up, or the tigers, whatever you want, anything that can bite. So that, and they realized that there is a data issue. They realized that there is a data class issue when it comes to
Hmm.
multiomics, metabolomics, whatever,
Right.
for example, or microbiomes, oral microbiomes, as well as gut
Hmm.
microbiomes. And the future will be also more inclusive and more diverse. So most nowadays, most drugs and medications and therapy regimes are tested with Caucasian participants from the USA or from Europe. The second largest ethnicity are people from China. If you study, if you go through the yearly publications, there's a vast amount from US and China. So
Right.
now you have different ethnicities, of course, in the Gulf states or in India or in Japan, and we know that that makes a difference. Some they respond differently to drugs. There is a different pharmacodynamic, and sometimes there is also even a different epidemiology and prevalence of tumor types. I stay with that oncological examples. So, for example, when it comes to breast cancer, triple negative breast cancer has a pretty poor prognosis. And around the world, in average, it's a 9 up to 12% of women have triple negative breast cancer. But for example, in Sri Lanka, it is up to 40%, and depends on the source you read. But definitely, it is by far more than in other ethnicities. So now that is, I would say, it is just not fair to skip most of ethnicities on the world and running that clinical trials with ethnicities that are something like, well, I would say, the Western world. To that as a headline, or to summarize that, and that will be the future of clinical trials, that you have to bring um, more ethnicities into the trials. And what also will be, in my opinion, is the pharmacovigilance and real world data once you have market approval of a drug. So it of course it is necessary to have a closer look on what happens in reality after the drug is out on the market.
Right. So, now that we are coming almost to the concluding part of our conversation, I would definitely like to know from you that what exactly is precision medicine?
Oh, that is minimum the second philosophical question. Now, what is precision and what is ground
Mm.
truth? If you want to be precise, you need something like a hook where you can start off. And I talked about the genetic data, for example, which is quite often the main case when people talk about precision medicine or personalized medicine or individualized medicine. But in fact, so far what we know nowadays, that there are a lot of subgroups,
Mm.
and we're quite glad if we can sort the patient into the right subgroup. So precision medicine, I would say nowadays, I never would say personalized, because that raises expectations from the
Right.
patient side. That is a promise we can't keep today. So
Mm.
precision
Mm.
nowadays means that we have by far a large amount of more diagnostic tools, and we should apply them. Then reimbursement is an issue, and precision medicine nowadays means that we go for more diagnostics and more theoretical consequences of that. But it's mainly, in my opinion, and there are different opinions, I have to mention that, but more than sorting people into the better subgroup with the better clue of therapeutical consequences, that is what precision medicine nowadays means. And not more, but not less. And it is already quite a good thing to have a better idea about patient subgroups.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And when it comes to all these advanced technologies in medicine for the betterment of the societal health, uh, and there is, as we all know, that there is a lot of generation of data, like whether it is clinical trial, and whether we are using precision medicine to diagnose something or predict some diseases. It's about data. So is there something where artificial intelligence can play a role? And if so, then what role has artificial intelligence to play here? If you can just give some idea about it, because I think that is the immune true all about, if I am not wrong.
Okay, mmunetrue focuses on the immune system as stratifier for all the data classes, because when you want to apply artificial intelligence nowadays, you have that curse of dimensionality that I have mentioned
Hmm.
before. You have
Hmm.
genetic tests, you have lab values, you have phenotype data from the patient file, and maybe you have also additional multiomics information. And that is too much data classes and too much data points from not enough participants. And if you want to stratify that vast ocean of data we are drowning in, then you need a stratifier to get an idea about potential subgroups where you can apply an artificial intelligence. Where AI nowadays is really pretty good is, apart from imaging that everyone cites, is chemistry. That is nowadays, I would say, the insider tip, that with
Hmm.
AI you can analyze the biology and the chemistry of molecules, and that gives you a clue. AI even can replicate discoveries like sometimes chemical weapons, which a team from Switzerland once did, I guess last year. So everything that has to do with chemistry and biology in de novo biomarker or drug discovery, that is the strength of AI. In clinical routine, AI struggles pretty much because there is so much data noise in the patient files, plenty of rare errors, but so many rare errors that you have too much noise for an AI. So that is difficult. Of
Hmm.
course, analyzing images from pathology or radiology, that is a good playground for an AI,
Right.
and I hope it will develop. And that is also where precision medicine and AI arrived in everyday life in that areas.
Correct. So now that precision medicine we talk about, and we hear a lot about all these things, uh, can you tell us that how far actually has precision medicine arrived in our everyday life?
I would say it arrived in the development of panel tests. If you compare the
Hmm.
panel tests 5 years ago or 10 years ago, these have been sometimes one or two targets. If you had a panel test with 20 items, that was great some years ago, not too far. But nowadays, you see big commercial panel suppliers with more than six
Yes.
hundred targets. And it is important to say that it is actionable, and the future will look like that we have more and more drugs for more
Hmm.
and more subgroups, and and more tests will refer to actionable targets. And it is quite common that nowadays, if you want to have a market approval for a new drug or a therapy regime, you also have to get approval for a companion diagnostic. So I would say we are entering into a decade of evolving companion diagnostic, and that also leads to more data granularity, more complexity. The physician needs treatment advice because he has the option of 5 drugs to treat the cancer, plenty
Correct.
drugs to treat the comorbidities, and if the patient has 2 comorbidities and each comorbidity offers maybe half a dozen opportunities or drugs to treat, and then you calculate just that five, five, then you have hundreds of combinations that are possible. And I guess that will be treatment decision support was promised for this decade. I would say treatment decision support will rise up from the US and other innovative countries at the end of this decade. And then, so maybe in 10 years, we really have treatment decision support systems that can handle that complexity, and that will be the future of precision medicine, of the clinical trial when it comes to trial design, and of course of analyzing real world data.
Right. So, as such, we can summarize that the future with precision medicine and including artificial intelligence and other relevant technologies, it is a very, very promising era that we are moving into with the disease diagnosis or bringing up more innovative therapeutic solutions. So, I think that was wonderful discussion that we had today, and. Thank you so much, Rudy, for being here. And I think I know that today is your birthday, but on this special day, still you made it. This is wonderful, actually. This is wonderful, and this made this episode very special, actually.
Yes, okay, that's only my only appointment today. So now I'm going to try to improve my gut microbiome by having my birthday cake.
Exactly, that is very important. Your gut microbiomes are waiting to chew on the creams that's going to get inside.
I guess my million friends are already prepared to get something like this.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, Rudy. So we'll take your leave, and I hope that in future we also come up with more interesting information from you. And thank you once again, and namaste from India. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.